Right, welcome to the Nations of Sanity. It's my great pleasure to introduce Walter Block, who has very kindly taken the time to have this conversation. Thank you, Walter.
My pleasure to be with you.
To most people already familiar with libertarianism, anarchism, or more specifically voluntarism, Walter Block needs no introduction. He is a pretty well-known and rightly respected philosopher and author of numerous books on the subject of anarchist principles. And for those who are not familiar with the Nations of Sanity, which is what I'm representing, this is a would-be movement that was proposing that we should establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a three-part peace agreement that we present, which is basically made up of part one being the basic agreement to establish the non-aggression principle as law, part two being what I call the lines in the sand, where we draw the sort of final dividing lines to separate what's objectively a violation of the non-aggression principle from more subjective grey areas. And part three is about rightful ownership, because property rights aren't much good if we don't agree on who owns what. And it is that final part of that agreement that brings me to the subject of the conversation I'm hoping to have with Walter today, which is the issue of property rights, and more specifically the idea of what we should privatise. Walter is of the position that we should privatise everything, if I'm not mischaracterising him in any way. And I've got a few questions on that, a few areas where I think I might disagree, a few areas where I definitely agree. And just before I hand over to Walter, I would like to say one of the reasons why I was so keen to have this conversation is the areas where we might potentially disagree are of great interest to me, because I'm very much on the same page as Walter on so much of the non-aggression principle. I think he's done a great job of presenting the principles in a consistent manner, and the way he applies them to various situations and scenarios. So I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation, and without further ado, I'll pass it over to Walter to introduce himself and the idea of privatising everything.
Well, I don't really favor privatizing everything. I only favor privatizing things that are scarce. For example, I don't think that there's any reason to privatize the moon now. We're not there, or Mars, or even oxygen on the Earth, because we've got plenty of it. Now, when we go to the moon or Mars, I think we should privatize oxygen, because it will be scarce then. And I've written a book on privatizing the oceans, lakes and rivers, and I don't even favor privatizing all of the oceans, because I don't think all of the oceans are scarce. But as traffic in the oceans starts increasing, there'll be certain areas, say, I don't know, between New York and London or something like that, or New York and, somewhere in Portugal, that would have to be scarce, and also airplane routes. I think to say fly from New York to London, you've got so many planes there that pretty soon that airspace will become scarce, and then I think it has to be privatized. Whereas in the 1400s, I don't think there was any need to privatize anything, because we didn't have to privatize air routes, because we didn't have airplanes then. So with that minor difference, I favor privatizing everything scarce.
Okay, can I just ask, why? What is it about being scarce? Is it the principle, or from a practical aspect, that's being scarce is the deciding factor for you?
Well, I think the whole point of property rights is to, as you said very eloquently, decide who owns what. Otherwise, we'll have a lot of difficulties. Like when I wake up in the morning, I go to my bathroom, and I don't want somebody to say, hey, you can't go to that bathroom. And then after I have breakfast, I get into my car, and I don't want somebody to say, well, that's my car. Whereas I'm now breathing air. And nobody's going to, I do race walking, competitive race walking, and I sometimes do a half marathon. This morning I did a 5K. And at the end of the race, you know what I was doing? I was going like this. I was panting because I was out of breath. And nobody came up to me and said, hey, you're hogging up too much air. Would you be a little bit more considerate and only take shallow breaths, not deep breaths? So I don't think there's any need to privatize air. except on the moon or Mars, which hopefully one of these days, sooner rather than later, we'll be going to. But right now, there's absolutely no need to privatize air.
Sure. So it is more of a practical issue rather than sort of it changing the principle. Would that be a correct assumption?
I'm not really sure about that. I haven't thought about it, and I thank you for bringing this up. I'll have to think about that, but I guess I'll go along tentatively, unless it fits me otherwise that it's not just pragmatic. I think it's certainly pragmatic, but I think it's also principled that, there's no need to privatize air or to maybe to privatize the land in the middle of Alaska or the middle of the Soviet Union, or rather Russia. What am I thinking about? There's no more Soviet Union. There is submarginal land that nobody wants, and I don't think there's any need to privatize that. But as population grows, then maybe the middle of Alaska or the middle of the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming, people are going to start homesteading there, and that'll be fine with me. But the fact that there's unowned land in the middle of Wyoming and the Rocky Mountains is okay. I'm not saying we must privatize it. So I think it's mainly pragmatic, but I think there might be a principle involved as well.
Right. Okay. Because I can certainly get on board with the idea of privatising air on the moon, because it's not something that naturally exists on the moon. So any air that would exist would be something that someone would have created. So it would, you know what I mean? It would be the sort of claim of property ownership would sort of be valid because there isn't already air naturally provided on the moon. Whereas I suppose the way I view that differently with Earth is, it's something that, we're born on this planet, and the air we breathe, I suppose, is part of something that's just kind of part of our I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for a positive right, because it's not something that anyone has an obligation to provide to you, but it's something that nature provides to us, like those basic essentials for life. So for me, I suppose I wasn't thinking of it so much as an issue of whether it was scarce or not, but more an issue that, sure, you could privatise air on the moon, because any air that's on the moon is air that you're taking there. If it's the product, it will be the product of your labour that it will be there. So it would be quite right that you would be entitled to, privately own any sort of area that was producing oxygen or an atmosphere or anything like that.
I think scarce is a better way to put it, because you put it in terms of naturally exist, but trees naturally exist, and yet we can own trees. I don't know, flowers naturally exist, a buffalo naturally exists, and yet we can privatize all of those things. So I think naturally exist is a good approximation, but I think a better way to characterize this is scarce.
I suppose so. I suppose scarce strikes me as more relevant to the practical concern than the principle. I suppose that's just where I was thinking of it. Like I say, privatising air on the moon is not something I have any problem with, because I'm like, well, yeah, that I can perfectly get on board with every step of someone owning air on the moon, because, as I say, there isn't already air on the moon, so they would have to take it there themselves as a product of their own effort. Whereas the air is already on this planet, or
create it there.
Yeah, exactly. So that claim of ownership comes through, their labour of creating it or bringing it there or whatever. But like I say, the air that's in the earth, I don't see how anyone has a right to claim ownership over that, whether it's scarce or not, because and I suppose, funnily enough, this actually strikes, and I'll just we can obviously come back to that, but I'll just move on to my sort of general question with regards to the idea of privatising, because one thing I remember you speaking on with regards to an issue of homesteading, which was where the non-aggression principle, and this is something I definitely agree with, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly on it, was when you spoke about donut-shaped homesteading and how that can't be done because of the idea of, for example, and no one can obviously see me, but imagine like a ring-shaped area that you were homesteading, and within that ring is either somebody else's property or perhaps an area that that no one owns, but you don't have a rightful claim of ownership, and by encircling it in the way you did with your own property and owned land, you would be prohibiting access to people to land that you don't have a right to prohibit them access to because you don't own it, or in the case of it being somebody else's property that's within that circle, you're obviously trapping them, imprisoning them, making it so that they can't leave or move without trespassing on your property. So, I mean, just to clarify, I am right to assume that you're of the opinion that someone would not be able to homestead in that fashion because they would violate the non-aggression principle?
Yes, that's correct. I would just add one thing, that there are no helicopters and there's no ability to tunnel under or build a bridge over or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
I think what you said is absolutely accurate.
And the same, in my mind, and this is where at any point in here, if I'm obviously taking this principle and not extrapolating it properly, please let me know. But in my mind, that principle lays the precedent for then saying, well, the same thing would apply to, for example, I don't know, it sounds ludicrous, but building something that blocked out the sun for somebody or something like that. Some kind of thing that violated the non-aggression principle. And even if under other circumstances, it's your rightfully owned property and you're doing with it, it wouldn't violate the non-aggression principle to collect the sun, but if you were doing it in a way that blocked the sunlight to somebody else's property or what have you, and that works off a similar principle with regards to the donut-shaped property. You can homestead where you like, as long as you obviously meet the requirements of labour mixing and whatever to do that. But as soon as you start infringing on other people in a way that you're denying them, the freedom to move, and then, like I say, this is where I add the access to these sort of what nature provides for free, if you like, with regards to the sun, the air, and stuff like that. I suppose that's where I get onto the issue of I see problems with the idea of everything being privatised, because I see, well, surely you're going to come into this donut-shaped scenario, like the same problem that you have with the donut-shaped homesteading, of infringing on other people's rights to move and perhaps access air or the sun or whatever, whatever the situation is. The fact that we have that principle where property rights, because it's obviously defined by the non-aggression principle, it is also restricted by it in that sense. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not sure how well I'm explaining myself, but...
No, I think you're making a very coherent argument. I have written about the sunlight and blocking the sun and all, and what I would do is divide this into two parts. There is this, what's the TV show with Mr. Burns?
Simpsons.
Simpsons. One day, what Mr. Burns did is he put a big... I'm sorry?
Sorry, I saw this episode that you're about to speak about, yeah.
What Mr. Burns did is he got a gigantic umbrella and he put it over the entire city, which would block out the sunlight so that people would have to buy more electricity from him because he had the electricity company.
Yep.
So the question is, was he violating rights in that? And I think he was, because everyone homesteaded the sunlight before, and now he's taking away something that they had a right to. So I would agree with you there that Mr. Burns shouldn't put a gigantic umbrella over the city or even over a farm. Suppose he owns some land and he put the umbrella over the next farm. And the farmer was depending on sunlight for his crops and had been using the sunlight for his crops for the last many years. And all of a sudden, Mr. Burns puts an umbrella over a gigantic umbrella. I think that would be a problem. On the other hand, I see a little difference, and maybe I'm wrong on this. I'll stand corrected by you if I'm wrong on this. Right now, you and I own two contiguous houses, and the houses are 1 story or 2 stories high. And then what I do is I build a gigantic building of 30 stories high, and now you can't see the moon. You can't see the sun. And the question is, I'm blocking your view. And what I'm trying to do is make a distinction between a view and the sunlight that you were depending upon before. And I don't think you can own views. I think you can own sunlight, but not views. For example, if I owned a view, or if people could own views of other people, then I don't like the way you're parting your hair. And now we have a conflict in rights. And for libertarianism, there can be no such thing as a conflict in rights. If there's a seeming conflict in rights, then one right is correct and one right is wrong. For example, I now set up a store and I say, I'm bald. So I say, this store is open to everybody except, just open to bald people, not people that have hair on their heads. And people with hair on their heads might say, you're violating my rights because you have a public store open to the public. And I say, no, there's no clash in rights because you have no right to come to my store. And this applies to people, if I want to discriminate against left-handed people or blacks or Jews or women or men or whatever. Namely, there's no right to come to my store. And if I want to discriminate, that's my right. So it seems to be a clash in rights, but really there's no clash. Namely, you don't have a right to come to my store unless I want you to come, or my house. Okay, but with regard to me building a 30-story building, I don't think that I'm taking away. It's true that for a certain period of time, you really can't see the sun, but you don't own the view, because if you own views, then we would have conflict in rights. Because I don't like the dress that this woman is wearing. I think it's too garish, and she likes it. And now we have a conflict in rights because I have a view of her that I don't like, and I want her to change her dress, and she says, no, I like this dress just fine. So that's a problem. So you don't own views. Now, suppose that I build this 30-story building right next to your farm. Now, it's true you're going to get a little less sunlight because, the building is only, 50 feet or 100 feet wide. It's not like an umbrella blocking out your entire farm. And in law, there is this thing called de minimis. Namely, the law does not take into account trifles. So when we exhale, we exhale carbon dioxide, which is a poison, and nobody should go to jail for exhaling. We certainly have homesteading rights to exhale. Our parents exhaled and our grandparents did. So what I'm trying to do is make a distinction between building a building that blocks your view and say you don't own views on the one hand, and on the other hand, it doesn't block your view, but it takes away your sunlight. And I'm saying that a building vis-a-vis an umbrella, is different. And now we get into a continuum problem. If I go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, I am a statutory rapist because even if she agrees, we don't think she's capable of any such thing. On the other hand, if I go to bed with a 25-year-old woman, and she agrees, well, then I'm not a statutory rapist because we think that 25-year-old women are adults and can make a decision about that. Well, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Should it be 15, 14, 16, 13, 15, whatever? Should it be 16 years and 2 months? There's no one right answer. It's a continuum problem. Or I'm now going to extend my fist towards you. Where are you? You're somewhere in England?
Yeah.
I'm now extending my fist in the direction of England. Do you have a right to shoot me? No. But if I get real close and it's dark and you don't know it's me because we're friends, I'm not going to hurt you, then you can. So what I'm saying is that there's a continuum between building a building and putting an umbrella over someone's farm. And the building would be okay, but not the umbrella. And how wide does the building have to be before it becomes, in effect, an umbrella? There's no one right answer, just as there's no one right answer to statutory rape. So that's the way I would think about that issue.
Yeah, I would actually have to say that I pretty much agree 100% with everything you said there. I fully agree that you don't own a view for the exact reasons you laid out, and I won't obviously repeat that because you explained that better than I probably would anyway. For one thing, it's such a subjective standard. Like you say, I could say I don't like the look of the people that move next to me. They're spoiling my view, and yeah, as you say, and I fully agree with that. Whereas the sun is a different issue because that's something that's more. Again, I do think that ties back to the issue of of privatising air and that, because it's that thing that you don't have a right to deny people, and that's where I feel like a potential non-aggression principle violation will come into it. I'm glad you mentioned about this continuum issue though, because that is a very important issue, and it's basically the reason why this three-part peace agreement is set up in this way, because originally when it was conceived of the idea of sort of saying, well, let's have a peace agreement to establish the Nappers law, at first it seems like, well, that's all you need to do. If we can agree to establish the non-aggression principles law, then we have a free society, simple as that. But as objective as the non-aggression principle is as a principle, when it does come into these areas, you do have this issue of, like you say, the continuum problem of, yes, it's wrong to initiate force against people, and normally that's pretty black and white. You know, if I punch you, that's black and white, and as you say. But the issue of, well, how closely can I fling my arm in your general direction, and where you exactly draw that line. We both understand the distinction between a competent adult that can consent to sex, drugs and legal contract is different from a vulnerable child who doesn't possess the understanding to give informed consent to these things. And the non-aggression principle, that lays out nice and black and whitely, but again, it doesn't solve the continuum problem, as you say. And the reason why the three-part agreement, part 2, is about setting those lines, those are the lines it's about setting, drawing those limits of tolerance, saying, well, perhaps we lack the sophistication to draw an exact line, like, for example, with age of consent, but we don't lack the sophistication to say, okay, but at this point, we can definitely say. And I have an article on my site about this called "Where the Desert Meets the Grassland," and it's a little bit of a laboured metaphor, but the way I sort of lay it out is I sort of say, geographically speaking, you've got the desert and you've got the grassland, and you've got this area in between where one sort of becomes the other. And like when you're dealing with violations of the non-aggression principle, in most cases it's pretty black and white. You know, it's like, you know, to use the desert metaphor, you're in the desert, you're surrounded by sand, there's no question you're in the desert. Just like in the grassland, you're surrounded by nothing but grass, you're in the grassland. But this area where one sort of becomes the other, and there's kind of features on both sides where it just perhaps lays a little bit of subjectivity, then that's where people can sort of agree to disagree, and the existence of these fuzzy edges shouldn't negate the black and white. Just because there is an area in between the grassland and the desert that's a little bit harder to define, that doesn't mean that we should allow people to stand in the middle of the desert and declare it grassland, and vice versa. You know, if we have to deal with the continuum problem, otherwise people will just stretch interpretations into absurdities to the point that they become meaningless. So that's actually the kind of motivation behind, setting up the agreement in that way. Going back to the issue of blocking out the sun and the view issue, I think the fundamental thing about that is your right to you don't have a right to a view, as you say. The view can be anything, and that's not something that affects you. The right to breathe air, the right to have some sort of access to the sun, like you say, there's one thing to have something that perhaps the sun doesn't shine on your land for a certain part of the day because of is far different to your land being completely blocked from having the sun to the point that it's detrimenting crops and what have you. So I think always, wherever you draw this line, the principle that has to be applied has to be to do with standards of harm and whether you can actually prove that you're being affected by it in some kind of tangible way, and that's perhaps a way that's perhaps a way that you can deal with that continuum. Like I say, you're sort of drawing a line of saying, okay, well, maybe we have an area where we can, that's a bit more grey and subjective, and perhaps those areas can only really be dealt with through voluntary collectives where people get together and voluntarily agree to more specific standards, but we can still draw lines around that where it's black and white, where we say, no, this is where it's non-aggression principle violation, and it doesn't matter who you are or what collective you're a part of, this is the line you're not allowed to cross, or you're aggressing against people, and force can be used against you. Sorry, I went on a bit there.
I think you set this discussion up because you had some pushback against some of my views. Do you want to articulate that?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, and now some of this is, like I say, clarifications and questions, and areas where I think I disagree, but I obviously want to sort of clarify your position in that. I mean, obviously, one of the areas was, like I say, the issue of owning air. On the moon, I see no problem with it. On Earth, I do see a problem with it, and I kind of invoke the same sort of principles that we spoke about with regards to the blocking of the sun or the donut-shaped homesteading, and, like I say, denying people things that they do have a sort of natural right to on this planet. But like I say, that doesn't mean it's the same on the moon, because air doesn't naturally exist on the moon, so any air that was there would be brought over. So I think that distinguishes for me, and like I say, I know that's something you said that you obviously think about. So the other sort of issues I just really wanted to question, actually, because one of the things I've heard, and I don't know if this is necessarily something that you are saying yourself, but one of the things I heard with regards to sort of preservation of the environment and the best ways to deal with that was through private ownership of, like rainforests and oceans and lakes and what have you. And the sort of obvious argument sort of behind that is with regards to the motivation to take care of such areas if it is your property. We all see the difference between privately owned toilets and public toilets, or any government-owned things, and those that are run by private industry. So I can certainly see the logic behind that. But one of the problems I have with it, well, I had two issues actually of pushback on that particular assertion. One was, although I can certainly think it's feasible to speak about how it would motivate people to preserve such areas, I can also imagine plenty of scenarios where someone might be motivated, if the profit incentive was right for them, to completely destroy such areas. But the more important factor, I suppose, is the fact that if it is their rightfully owned property, they would have the right to destroy. If someone owned an ocean, or even if a group of people owned oceans or whatever, they would have the right to sort of do with that ocean what they will within reason, and then that sort of opens up the potential for other NAP violations. And one other quick thing I just wanted to add to that as well, the other problem I see with it is the way we homestead and the way we acquire ownership over things through the mixing of labour. There seems to be a paradox between gaining ownership of something like an ocean or a rainforest and keeping it in its natural state. How do you sort of do that when the labour mixing requirements to claim ownership over it would sort of contradict with that? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I see what you're saying. So you're really asking two questions. Let me repeat them to make sure I'm clear on what you're asking. One is, private property rights might not be so good because somebody could destroy their own private property, and that would hurt people. And secondly, suppose you want to have a nature preserve. You want to have some pure piece of nature, 10 acres or 100 acres, where no human being touches it, and we just sort of leave it as a nature preserve. How then can we own it if the only way you can own it is by homesteading it, and homesteading means mixing your labor with it? Am I understanding your two questions?
The second question perfectly. The first question, I would just sort of... sorry, how did you sort of say it again?
Well, I own a forest. It's 1,000 acres, and I'm just stupid or evil or whatever.
Right, the motivation to destroy. Yeah, I mean, that one,
and
I
destroy my forest. It's my forest, and I can destroy it if I want, but if people like me own forests, we're not going to have forests, and that's not going to help the GDP. It's not going to help prosperity, because we need forests for prosperity. So is that... I suppose what I'm saying is there might be a motivation to destroy it as a forest because you can do something else with it that would still be of benefit to you, but it's not obviously preserving it as a forest. Just that, I didn't mean sort of destroying it just because you're a madman that wants to destroy your own property, but I mean it's kind of linked to the whole. That's kind of what followed on from the whole, well, how do you homestead it in the first place without destroying it? And then if you are able to solve that problem of homesteading a natural area, yet even though you might be motivated because you own it to look after it, you might also be motivated if to use it as like a toxic dumping ground or whatever, because it's monetarily valuable for you to do so or whatever. But the issue is the fact that you would have the right to, because you would own it. If you had the right to, if you owned the ocean, you'd have the right to use it as a sewage dump if you wanted to. Do you see what I mean? So yeah, but I mean, the second question you understood fully. I just want to make that clarification on the first one. Okay, well, let me try to answer both now. Let me try to answer the second one first. The nature preserve, where we want a pure nature and untouched by human hands, and we want to just preserve it. But how does anyone get to own it if the only way to own it is by homesteading it, and that means mixing your labor with it? My friend Michael Edelstein and I have written a paper on this. And what we said in there, and I still think that we've got the correct answer to this conundrum or this problem. Well, see, Murray Rothbard well, other people try to answer this, and they said, well, you could get to own it by putting in a washroom so that if people walked in it, they, would you be able to use the washroom, and maybe you'd put in some lights so the people didn't get lost at night. But the problem with that is that it's not really a pure nature preserve, and we want a pure nature preserve, and we want it so pure that nobody even goes in there and hikes. We want it pure. No human beings, no feet, no hands, no nothing, as we say in Brooklyn. And the answer that Michael Edelstein and I proposed was, you don't have to homestead things with your own hands and feet. You can homestead things with cows. For example, I now have a herd of cows.
Okay.
And there's nature out there. There's untouched virgin land. And what I do is I'm on a horse and I, sort of herd the cows here or sheep or whatever it is. And after a while, I own that sheep range or that cow pasture, even though I never touched anything. I did it indirectly through cows. Now, there's always a problem when you talk about homesteading about how intensive do you have to homestead. Do you have to let's say I'm homesteading by putting in corn plants. Do I have to put a corn plant in every square foot, every square yard, every acre, every square mile, every 10 square miles? What? And the way Murray Rothbard does this, and I'm a devotee of his. He's my mentor, and he's sort of channeling John Locke on this. Is the more fertile the land, the more intensively you have to homestead. So east of the Mississippi in the United States, Murray said that 160 acres was pretty much all that a family of four, mother, father, and two little kids could homestead, and that was enough to keep them going and prospering. Whereas west of the Mississippi, which is much less fertile, I think he came up with 1,600 acres as a plausible example, because there it's less fertile, and you don't have to put in a corn plant every square inch or every square 3 inches or something. You can put it every square yard or every square 10 yards or something like that. And then how do you homestead land in the desert? Well, again, the desert is even less fertile than west of the Mississippi, so you can do it even less intensively. How about Mars or the moon? Well, even less intensively. So I set up a shop on the Mars or on the moon, and I don't own the whole moon and I don't own the whole Mars, but I own, maybe 10 square miles of it, even though I'm only occupying an acre, because even less intensive. So what I'm saying is that one way to homestead land west of the Mississippi is put in corn plants or wheat plants or whatever. But another way is through cows. Or sheep. So I now have a herd of cows or sheep, and I don't even touch it, and I now own some land, maybe an appreciable amount of land, because it's not very fertile even for cows or sheep. Okay, so now let's get back to this nature preserve.
Yeah.
What I do is I get some worms from elsewhere, and I get some bugs and some beetles and some snakes and some of this and some of that. And what I do is I throw them into the nature preserve. And I own those bees and birds and creepy crawly things and worms and insects and all that. And I sprinkle enough of them in this nature preserve of 1 square mile or 10 square miles or whatever it is. And I can do it by helicopter to make sure I get coverage all over. And now I own the nature preserve, and now we can have our cake and eat it. We can have a nature preserve, which seems to be a problem for the homesteading theory, and we can also adhere to homesteading. We can have our cake and eat it, namely we can have both. We can have the nature preserve untouched by human hands. We throw a bunch of snakes and birds and other creepy crawly creatures in there, and now we own it. And we tell people we own it, and we homesteaded it. We didn't homestead it directly, but we homesteaded it indirectly. And there were worms and bugs and other creatures in there before we came with our bugs, and maybe even cows or sheep. I don't know. Maybe in nature preserve we don't even want cows or sheep. If we want cows and sheep, then I get a bunch of cows and sheep of mine, and I stick them in there. I sort of herd them in there. I don't go there because, God forbid, I should touch the nature preserve, but I push them in there. But if we don't want cows or sheep, well, then we get, I don't know, dogs or wolves or creepy crawly things. So I think that's the answer to the first one. Now let me talk about the second one. The second one, or really the first one, I answered the second one first. Now I'm a pervert, so I can't answer them in the order that you face them. This one, the question of I now destroy. I now own a forest because I homesteaded the whole forest, and I have 1,500 acres or 15,000 square miles. Well, maybe not that much, but I own an appreciable forest, and I start destroying it. Now, I don't destroy it with fires that get over into your forest because that would violate your rights. But I keep the fire confined to mine, and now all of a sudden you were talking about a desert. Well, in West Virginia, they used to, there are two ways to mine coal. One is deep mining. The problem with that is cave-ins. The other is surface mining. You just scoop up the coal, you dig in, and at the end, it sort of looks like a desert. Well, I don't want to get into whether that's justified or not, but what I do with my forest is I burn it down, and it's just burned down to nothing, and it's like a horrible desert. And isn't this a problem? Should we allow me to own land? And I'm not the only one like that. A bunch of weirdos out there. Okay, the answer to that is there's a joke. The Economist was asked, "How is your wife?" And the answer was, "Compared to what?" That's supposed to be a joke. Well, the way I would use this joke for the destruction of property is as follows. I would say, compared to what? Well, there are only several ways. There are only three ways to deal with property like forests. One is private ownership, and we can see a problem with private ownership, namely the private owner will burn it down. The second one is unowned. We just don't allow anyone to own forests, and the problem with that is the tragedy of the commons. If no one owns it, no one takes care of it, there are problems. And the third one is government owns it. And there are problems with that too. The problem with the government owning it is, we had experience of collectivized farming in the Soviet Union where they owned farms and they practically starved to death. And also, government is not really an institution compatible with libertarianism because they're based on coercion. And so I think, yes, there are problems with the free enterprise system that the owners of the stuff might destroy it, and that's not helpful. However, the other two options are way worse, and also there are good and sufficient reasons to think that not much of this is going to happen because, look, if I'm an idiot and I'm purposely destroying my own property, well, I'm not going to get to own too much property. Or possibly I was really good at owning property, and I was very productive. That's how I got to own this land in the first place. And now I became senile, and now I'm destroying it. Okay, well, I'm not going to own more property. In other words, there's a limit as to how much harm I can do. And the point is that people who do this sort of thing are not people who get to own much property. The way to get to own a lot of property is to take care of it. So I think the other two options are horrible. This one is imperfect, but look, we're not in the Garden of Eden. We're outside of the Garden of Eden. We're in reality. And in reality, people make mistakes. There are a lot of mistakes that people make. Look, not just burning down property, which is a physical destruction, but, you remember the hula hoop?
Hula hoop?
You remember the hula hoop? Or how old are you?
Yeah, I remember the hula hoop. As in the thing that people spun around their waist, you mean?
Right.
Yeah. I'm 37.
Okay. How old are you?
37.
37. You're old enough to know that. The people in our audience might be too young to know that. Well, there was a time that people made too many hula hoops. And they didn't destroy property, but they destroyed economic value by converting plastic into hula hoops when the phase had passed. And then there's also, when the car came in, what about blacksmiths? Right before the car came in, somebody set up a new blacksmith shop, and a new bridle shop, and a new saddle shop, and a new horse breaking venture. And then the car came in, and all that stuff was economically destroyed. You see, in the forest fire, I purposely destroyed physical wealth. But when new inventions come about, or take the computer and the typewriter, there was once this thing called a typewriter. I don't know if you're old enough to know what a typewriter is.
Just about.
But a typewriter is just sort of like a computer thing, only it doesn't have a screen. You just stick paper in there. And this was a going concern. And a lot of wealth was destroyed, not physically. The typewriters were still there, but nobody wanted them. So, yes, this is a problem with free enterprise. Well, it's not really a market failure. It's not a problem with free enterprise. It's a problem with human beings aren't omniscient. Namely, they didn't know that we're going to get a computer. So they made typewriters. So that's destruction. But does this mean that we should turn over industry to non-ownership and we have the problem, the tragedy of the commons? Or does it mean that we should turn, God forbid, all of industry over to government? Government screws up too. And they don't have much incentives. And, Hayek talks about, well, they don't have the proper information without market prices. And Mises talks about, it's impossible to plan if you don't have free enterprise with prices. So I think government owning is not good, is way worse. And non-ownership is way worse. And okay, so we destroy some property, not because there's anything wrong with the free market system. I don't believe in market failure. All market is voluntary trade. I'm wearing a green shirt. You can see me. I can't see you. I've got a green shirt. I paid, $20 for it. At the time I bought it, I valued it more than 20, and the guy who sold it to me valued it less than 20. So that's what the market is. So ex ante, the market is always productive. Ex post, sometimes you regret buying a shirt. So what? That's the human condition. It's not the market's fault. So that would be the way I would answer your first question. Yes, so let the guy destroy his farm or his factory or whatever, blow up his factory, and let's just praise God that we have a free enterprise system where paradoxically he can destroy property, physically destroy property, because that's part and parcel of economic freedom. Look, he earned that money fair and square by producing stuff, or he inherited it from his parents who provided goods and services. And one of the concomitants of providing goods and services, you get rich. And when you get rich, you can provide a lot of stuff. And sometimes you can make errors. And either by destroying physical property or by creating stuff that nobody wants anymore, like the hula hoop or the typewriter or the blacksmith emporium.
Yeah, I think we both agree that it's obviously not a violation of the non-aggression principle to do someone harm in the sense of making them obsolete, like with regards to outcompeting them or whatever. So I don't really think that's comparable to the issue. I suppose, but just to clarify where I'm coming at from the issue of like burning down the forest and. Funnily enough, the formula you laid out with regards to the labour mixing requirements, that's quite novel actually, and I must admit the way the formula expands works quite well. My only concern with that particular solution is, as much as the formula can expand quite well with regards to the less labour intense. The less labour required for the amount of land you're sort of claiming homesteading over, but the sort of starting point, like the requirements that you mentioned at the beginning, seem somewhat subjective and, dare I say, arbitrary. It's all very well saying, well, this is how much someone really needs, and then we'll extrapolate from there with regards to scaling up and down. But for one thing, as the world changes, even if we could agree on where that line is or where that starting point is, that was something that could change as the world changes, with regards to what people require and what have you. But just to go with the three options that you mentioned that we have, and I agree those are the three options. It's either private ownership, no one owns it, or government ownership. And I'm 100% with you that we just throw the government option completely out the window. That's not even feasible. For one thing, government is a criminal organisation. It doesn't have a rightful ownership over anything because it acquires everything through coercion and force and what have you. So that's not even an option. We can take that off the table. Funnily enough, though, the other option of it being unowned is kind of where I was coming from. But I'm not applying this to everything. Don't mistake me for a commie. What I'm actually applying this to, and I'd be interested to see what you think of this approach. Just going back to the principle that we established with regards to why you can't donut-shaped homestead because you're violating people's right to, to move out of their property or to an area that you don't rightfully own or what have you. And just as I think that also applies to owning the air on this planet at least, and also applies to things like blocking out the sun, and like I say, I think there's certain things that we have a natural right access to, that if you deny someone the air, not that anyone has the technology to do that, but if someone could just suck out all the air of this planet, that is clearly a NAP violation for me, because obviously that's a direct cause of harm to people. Even though no one owns the air, everyone has a right to use it, and I think you can apply that to a minimal level of nature that is required to maintain our ecosystem. So it's not like people can't own any forests, but what I'm saying is you would have to draw a line based on the same principle of as you would with regards to the donut-shaped homesteading, and saying, well, look, if, say you can own some property next to the east of me, and you can own some property to the north of me, and the west of me, and the south of me, and the southeast of me, and the southwest, but you can't homestead all of that because you're trapping me. Like you say, going back to the no, I don't have a helicopter and all that sort of business. So what I'm saying is you could extrapolate the same principle, at least this was my thinking on it, with regards to, and you could actually extend that to an issue of environment. And when it comes to nature preserve, I think you could only invoke the non-aggression principle to preserve nature in an area where you're actually protecting against harmful damage to the environment. I don't think you could just do it from an aesthetic point of view. Like, I like this much nature, so this much people can't own. It would still have to be down on that same principle of the non-aggression principle, where we would deem it an act of an aggression. For example, and just to give a real-world example, I would say, for numerous reasons, what's going on in the Brazilian rainforests at the moment is very much not valid. It is very much a violation of the non-aggression principle, because they're destroying areas that are vital to the natural environment. I forget about like the people that are actually being sort of killed in the process, indigenous tribes and what have you, but just the fact that, and forget even the fact that the government, who obviously gives these various corporations the right to clear these forests for cattle grazing or whatever else they're using it for, and forget the fact that the governments don't have a rightful claim of ownership anyway, so to then pass on. The other issue is like I say, it's when it gets to that point where you're actually causing damage to the environment in a tangible way that's harming others, then I think that's when the line should be drawn. So I do think there is a scope within the non-aggression principle for actually saying that some things cannot be owned. And I think you deal with the tragedy of the commons issue by sort of saying that, like say you've got like these oceans, you can't dump this in there, and you can't do this that would destroy the sort of like you can fish, but you can only fish sustainably. If you clear it all out so no one else can fish, then that for me is an act of an aggression, because you're actually damaging the natural environment with which we all sort of depend. I hope I've been coherent in that.
Matt, let me interrupt you, because I'm only devoting an hour to this, and we're coming very quickly to the close of the hour, and you've raised 4 very important points, and I'm going to take 30 seconds on each. Because I want to get off in about a minute or two. Sucking out all the air and keeping it or sending it off into space or something, I think would be a violation of rights, because we have homesteaded the right to breathe in a normal amount of air. And if somebody sucks out all the air of the earth and sends it into space, he's violating rights, shouldn't be allowed to do it. The entrapment, I have this book, The Privatization of Roads and Highways, and I deal with that entrapment problem in a whole chapter, maybe 30 or 40 pages, so I'll just summarize it very briefly. And what I say there is, right now, when you buy a house, you get title insurance to make sure that the guy who's selling you the house is really the owner. Well, when you buy a house now, And under free enterprise, you're also going to get access insurance. So you're going to look at the access. You're not going to buy a house or a piece of land unless you're clear as you can get out on the road. And the road owner is going to have every incentive to try to get you to buy that house so that there'll be more people on his road. So that's the second one. The third one is the Brazilian rainforest. And what's going on there is that the problem with the Brazilian rainforest is that it's unowned, or the government owns it. And Brazil and Argentina are having this sort of macho fight as to who can have more cattle ranches. And what the government there is doing is subsidizing the cutting down of the Brazilian rainforest. So again, this is not a market problem. This is a government problem. And the last one you talk about is fish sustainability. And I have another book on that. It's called Water Capitalism, The Case for Privatizing Oceans, Rivers, Lakes, and Aquifers. And in that chapter on fish, what I say is that if we own the ocean, see, right now, people don't own anything, and this is the tragedy of the commons. All these fishing boats, they grab up all the fish, and if they were allowed to grab up all the fish, there'd be no more fish, or no more whales, or anything like that. And the idea here, and then what they do is they limit the size of the fishing boat and the efficiency of the fishing boat, and then they have fishing seasons, and all sorts of problematic ways of dealing with the problem. But the answer, I think, the answer that I offer in this book is if you privatize the oceans, then people will keep the fish going. It'll be their fish. There'd be no reason to overfish because you own all the fish in the area. We even now have fish farming. And with fish farming, 99% of the fish survive, 99% of the eggs turn into fish, whereas in the oceans, it's a much smaller amount. So what I'm thinking of is, at one time, we human beings were hunting and gathering stages, and now, happily, we moved to farming, and then we moved to manufacturing. Well, the oceans were in the hunting and gathering stages. Why? Because of the tragedy of the commons, because of the lack of ownership of the ocean. If people own bits of the ocean, they would own all the fish, and there'd be no more overfishing any more than this overkilling of cows. No farmer kills all of his cows, because if he doesn't kill them, he's got them tomorrow. Whereas in the ocean, if you don't get those fish, somebody else will get them. Whereas if fish were put on the economic basis of cows, then we'd have no problem of fish sustainability, nor do we have any problem of cow sustainability. Matt, it's been really wonderful talking to you for this hour, but I only allotted an hour. I'd love to go on for another 5 hours with you, but I've got other work to do. So, again, thanks for having me on your show.
I understand that, and I very much thank you. If I could just give you one final little point just to leave you with, I won't expect you to respond to, but I do think that the tragedy of the common situation that you mentioned is only a problem because we don't have the non-aggression principle as the law established as a peace agreement. And I do think that would also solve that problem, because if it's unowned, people wouldn't be able to go into it for that reason, and it would be protected in the same way that private property would, even without anyone owning it. But so I'll leave you with that. And
I'll let you have the last substantive word, and I'll just say thanks for having me again.